April 1943. The war room was already suffocating with urgency when the cable arrived, not because it was long or detailed, but because it wasn't. No pleasantries, no operational codes, no justification, just a few stark lines that carried the weight of an accusation. A victory had been claimed at dawn, a major coastal city taken ahead of schedule. And then, without pause or explanation, came the final sentence, cold, confident, and unmistakably demanding. "I'll expect delivery as agreed." The room went quiet. Maps covered the walls. Pins marking front lines where thousands of men were still fighting and dying. Radios crackled in the background. Outside, engines roared as aircraft lifted into hostile skies. Inside, none of that mattered anymore. Because every officer in that room felt the same chill at once. The sense that something had gone terribly wrong. The Supreme Allied commander read the cable twice, then a third time. He wasn't confused by the victory. He was unsettled by the certainty behind the demand. This was not a request. It was not a negotiation. It was a claim, spoken with the authority of someone who believed the debt was already owed. But owed for what? There was no written agreement, no formal authorization, no record of any promise that justified what the sender was demanding, and yet the tone of the message suggested something far more dangerous than a misunderstanding. It suggested memory, intent, expectation. Someone somewhere had spoken too casually. A sentence had been thrown into the air, dismissed as humor, forgotten by the man who said it. But the man who heard it had not forgotten. He had waited, calculated, planned. And now, with a battlefield victory as leverage, he was calling in the debt. In war, misunderstandings usually cost time or resources. This one threatened something more fragile, the trust holding an alliance together. At a moment when unity mattered more than firepower, ego had found a way into the command structure. The commander knew what refusing would mean. The argument wouldn't stay in that room. It would climb ladders, political, diplomatic, personal, spreading tension where cohesion was essential. And all because of a few careless words spoken weeks earlier to the wrong man with the wrong temperament. Outside, young soldiers prepared for missions they might not survive. Inside, senior leaders wrestled with a different kind of danger, the realization that sometimes the most destructive weapons in war are not bombs or bullets, but promises. This wasn't just the beginning of a story about an airplane. It was the beginning of a story about pride, power, and the price of keeping the peace. And if you want to understand how a single sentence reshaped relationships at the highest levels of command, how a joke became a contract, and how that contract nearly fractured an alliance, make sure you stay with us to the very end. If you find stories like this compelling, subscribe to the channel and support our work. It's the best way to help us keep bringing you powerful, untold moments from history that still matter today. Before we continue, here's a quick question for you. Which do you think is more dangerous in war? A, losing critical equipment. B, losing trust between allies. Comment A or B below, and let's see how history and this story answers that question. The moment that set everything in motion did not happen on a battlefield, and it did not involve gunfire or explosions. It happened in a room where men believed they were speaking freely, protected by rank, familiarity, and the false safety of shared purpose. The meeting took place at a forward headquarters near Alexandria, a place designed for planning, not for careless words. General Andrew Calloway had sent his chief of staff, General Marcus Hale, to coordinate timelines and logistics with General Lionel Harrington, whose forces were driving relentlessly along the coast. Harrington arrived as he always did, precise, composed, and unreadable. He listened more than he spoke, his eyes tracing maps as if he were already rewriting them in his mind. Toward the end of the briefing, Harrington raised a matter that caught Hale off guard. He spoke calmly, almost casually, about mobility, about efficiency, about the wasted hours spent moving between commands by convoy while decisions waited on the ground. Then he said it plainly. He wanted a heavy bomber assigned to him for transport. Hale didn't hide his disbelief. Bombers were scarce, sacred assets. Each one represented hundreds of hours of labor and the lives of young crews who flew them into hell. The request crossed an invisible line between necessity and indulgence. Hale chose not to confront it directly. Instead, he reached for humor, the kind officers use to deflect unreasonable demands without igniting open conflict. "If you take Marseille before mid-April," Hale said, allowing himself a thin smile, "we'll find you a bomber." In Hale's mind, the remark ended there, a sarcastic full stop. He moved on to the next agenda item and never looked back. Harrington did. What Hale failed to understand was not arrogance, but difference. Harrington did not live in the gray space between jest and seriousness. He lived in outcomes, in benchmarks, in challenges accepted and victories earned. He did not hear sarcasm. He heard terms, and more importantly, he heard an opportunity. Harrington had built his career on wagers of will. He believed that pressure revealed character, and deadlines separated leaders from talkers. To him, Hale's comment was not a dismissal. It was a test, a public one, and Harrington never ignored a test placed before him. From that moment on, Marseille ceased to be merely a strategic objective. It became a personal measurement. Every mile gained, every supply line tightened, every order sharpened by the quiet knowledge that something larger was at stake. Not just territory, but acknowledgement, proof. Meanwhile, Hale returned to his duties, unburdened, unaware that a casual sentence had embedded itself in Harrington's thinking like a seed. There were no memos exchanged, no clarifications requested. Harrington did not seek confirmation because, in his world, a man's word, spoken in the presence of peers, was confirmation enough. This is where alliances grow fragile, not in betrayal, but in assumption. One man believed he had deflected a problem. Another believed he had been given a promise, and neither realized how high the cost of that misunderstanding would be. War magnifies everything: courage, fear, ambition, ego. It turns offhand remarks into leverage and transforms humor into obligation. Harrington understood this instinctively. He also understood timing. He knew that if he delivered early, decisively, and undeniably, the words spoken in Alexandria would become impossible to walk back. What Hale dismissed as a joke, Harrington carried as a contract, unwritten, unofficial, but no less binding in his mind. And once such a contract exists, the question is no longer whether it should be honored. The only question left is what happens if it isn't. To understand why General Lionel Harrington treated a casual remark like a binding vow, you have to understand the man himself, not the uniform, not the reputation, but the private machinery that drove his decisions long before anyone noticed the consequences. Harrington was not motivated by comfort. He lived with almost monastic restraint. He drank little, slept less, and tolerated no softness in himself or others. While other commanders sought relief in small pleasures, Harrington believed indulgence dulled the edge required to win wars. Discipline to him was not a tool. It was an identity. But discipline alone did not explain him. Beneath that rigid exterior lived a man obsessed with measurement. Harrington believed that leadership could be quantified, dates met, objectives taken, rivals outpaced. He did not merely want success. He wanted proof. Proof that could not be argued away, minimized, or shared. He competed constantly, not only against the enemy, but against fellow commanders, allies, and expectations. Every campaign was a comparison, every victory a statement. He was especially sensitive to symbols. Harrington understood what men noticed, what they whispered about in mess halls and briefing rooms, who had the newest equipment, who received the quickest approvals, who moved freely while others waited. To him, power was not only exercised, it was displayed, and displays mattered. This is why the idea of a personal bomber resonated so deeply. It was never about convenience. Harrington could endure long drives, dust, discomfort. He had endured far worse. What mattered was what the aircraft represented. It was unmistakable. Heavy bomber was not assigned lightly. To be given one was to be set apart, to be acknowledged as indispensable. Harrington did not crave admiration in the traditional sense. He rarely sought praise and dismissed flattery outright. What he wanted was recognition through action, through exceptions made on his behalf. In his mind, if the system bent for him, it was because he had earned the right to bend it. Those under his command felt the weight of his expectations every day. Harrington drove his forces relentlessly, demanding speed, precision, and obedience. He believed momentum saved lives, even when it cost comfort or morale. His men respected him, feared him, and followed him, often without fully understanding where his urgency came from. They assumed it was strategic. They did not see the personal calculus underneath. Because Harrington never separated the mission from himself. Every deadline was personal. Every challenge was a test of will. Failure was not an outcome. It was a verdict. And wagers, once accepted, became a form of motivation he understood intimately. They sharpened his focus. They stripped ambiguity from effort. Win, and the world would acknowledge it. Lose, and no explanation would matter. This mindset had served him well. It had propelled him upward, set him apart, and built a reputation for results, but it also narrowed his vision. Harrington began to see agreements where others saw banter, obligations where others saw flexibility. He assumed that everyone else played by the same internal rules. That assumption was dangerous, because war is not governed by one man's code. It is a web of competing priorities, fragile alliances, and shared sacrifice. Harrington's pride, so effective on the battlefield, made him blind to how his personal symbols affected others. Men who fought without recognition, commanders who lacked his access, and allies who interpreted his demands as entitlement. Still, Harrington did not view himself as selfish. In his mind, his ambition was justified by results. He believed that winning excused the methods, that speed forgave pressure, and that exceptional performance warranted exceptional treatment. And when the time came to claim what he believed he had earned, he did so without hesitation. Because to Harrington, a wager honored was not arrogance. It was proof that the world still rewarded those bold enough to demand it. The city fell faster than anyone had predicted. Reports confirmed it before dawn, clean and decisive, the kind of victory commanders dream about but rarely receive. Lines on the map shifted, supply routes tightened, and an enemy stronghold that had resisted for months was suddenly silent. For the men who fought there, it was a moment of exhaustion and relief. For the high command, it was a strategic success that demanded swift follow-through. For General Lionel Harrington, it was something else entirely. He did not linger over congratulatory messages or ceremonial acknowledgments. He did not tour the captured ground or pause to let the victory settle. Almost immediately, he sent a message north to Allied headquarters. The words were precise, restrained, and unmistakably deliberate. He did not remind anyone of what had been said weeks earlier. He did not explain. He simply stated the fact of victory and followed it with an expectation. Within minutes, the mood at headquarters shifted. General Andrew Calloway recognized the problem instantly. Harrington was not celebrating, he was collecting. Calloway convened his senior staff. General Marcus Hale was there, suddenly confronted with a remark he had not thought about since it left his mouth. The room filled with competing instincts. Military logic argued against compliance. Heavy bombers were stretched thin, desperately needed to sustain pressure on the enemy. To reassign one now would weaken ongoing operations and send the wrong message to every commander struggling with fewer resources. But strategy does not exist in isolation. Calloway understood that refusing Harrington carried consequences far beyond logistics. Harrington was not merely a subordinate. He was a symbol of Allied momentum, a commander with political capital and influential advocates. If he felt publicly dismissed, the dispute would not remain contained. It would escalate, reframed not as a resource issue, but as a matter of honor and credibility. Calloway faced an equation no field manual addressed. On one side was principle, the belief that no individual, however successful, should bend the system to serve personal claims. On the other side was cohesion, the fragile unity of an alliance built on compromise and mutual restraint. The decision weighed heavily. Calloway knew that honor in the demand would breed resentment among other commanders who fought with less and asked for nothing. He also knew that denying it would fracture trust at the highest level, distracting leaders when focus was desperately needed elsewhere. In the end, Calloway chose containment over confrontation. He authorized the reassignment. The bomber was selected quietly, its mission altered without ceremony. Its crew, young men who had flown through flak and fire, were informed that their role had changed. They would still fly, still serve, but now their purpose was symbolic as much as operational. They were no longer just combatants. They were part of a political solution. News of the decision traveled quickly through command circles. Some reacted with disbelief, others with anger they did not voice. There were commanders who moved between fronts by jeep and convoy, exposed to danger daily, who could not understand how victory translated into privilege for one man and sacrifice for everyone else. Harrington, for his part, accepted the aircraft without visible triumph. He did not gloat or explain. To him, the outcome required no justification. A challenge had been met, an expectation fulfilled. The system had acknowledged his result. But beneath the surface, something shifted. The victory that should have unified the alliance instead left behind quiet divisions, not loud enough to disrupt operations, but deep enough to linger. Calloway understood this, even as he signed the order. He had preserved the peace, but not without cost, because some victories arrive carrying invisible strings, and once they tighten, they rarely loosen without leaving marks behind. In the weeks that followed, the bomber became part of the landscape, present, visible, and quietly unsettling. It sat on airfields like a monument no one had voted to build, its presence understood by everyone but discussed by few. For General Lionel Harrington, it functioned exactly as intended. It carried him swiftly between commands, insulated him from the delays that plagued others, and signaled, without a word spoken, that his victories translated into tangible exception. For those who flew it, the meaning was far more complicated. The crew carried out their new assignment with professionalism, but the shift was impossible to ignore. These were men who had measured time and mission survived, who had watched empty bunks multiply after every sortie. Now they flew shorter routes, safer skies, guarding a general instead of pressing the war forward. No one questioned their courage, but the irony was sharp. They had not earned safety. It had been reassigned to them. Within the broader command, the bomber cast a longer shadow. Officers who had accepted shortages as the price of war now questioned the calculus. If success yielded privilege for one, what did restraint earn the rest? The alliance did not fracture openly, but a quiet ledger began to form, one that tracked not just victories and losses, but favors granted and denied. General Andrew Calloway felt that ledger every day. He had chosen peace over principle, unity over precedent. On paper, the decision made sense. Harrington remained effective. Operations continued. No formal complaints reached his desk. But Calloway understood leadership well enough to recognize deferred costs. What he had avoided in confrontation he now paid in morale and trust. Even General Marcus Hale, who had spoken the words that ignited the crisis, sensed the change. His influence carried less weight. His offhand authority, the confidence that systems would correct themselves, had been shaken. He had learned painfully that intent mattered less than interpretation, and that senior leaders were judged not only by what they meant, but by what others believed they had promised. Harrington, meanwhile, remained largely untouched by doubt. He viewed the episode as confirmation rather than controversy. The system had responded as he believed it should. Performance had been rewarded. Results had spoken louder than objections. If resentment existed, it was not his responsibility to manage it. War, in his view, was not an exercise in fairness. It was an arena where outcomes justified imbalance. Yet even Harrington could not entirely escape the consequences. When the bomber later suffered damage during a hard landing near Naples, grounding it indefinitely, the reaction from headquarters was telling. There was no urgency to replace it, no willingness to revisit the exception. The silence that followed was deliberate. The moment had passed. The bomber, once a symbol of recognition, became a reminder of excess, of how easily lines blurred when pride met accommodation. Calloway's refusal to authorize a replacement was not punitive, it was corrective. One concession had been absorbed. A second would have redefined the alliance in ways he could no longer accept. In the end, the real cost of keeping the peace was not measured in aircraft or missions diverted. It was measured in subtle shifts, how leaders spoke to one another, how trust was rationed, how future negotiations were approached with caution instead of confidence. The alliance endured, but it did so with new awareness. That harmony preserved through appeasement carried risks as real as open conflict. The story did not end with a crash or confrontation. It ended with understanding that in war, as in leadership, peace is often bought on credit, and eventually someone must pay the balance. When the story is viewed as a whole, it becomes clear that it was never truly about an aircraft, a wager, or even a single decision made in the pressure-filled rooms of wartime command. At its core, this was the story of a man, General Lionel Harrington, and the collision between personal ambition and collective responsibility. Harrington was not a villain, nor was he a hero in the simple sense. He was a product of his environment, shaped by a world that rewarded decisiveness, confidence, and results. He believed deeply in performance as the ultimate currency of leadership. In his mind, winning was not only about defeating the enemy, it was about proving one's worth in a hierarchy where recognition equaled influence. His relentless drive pushed campaigns forward, accelerated victories, and saved lives in ways that will never be fully measured. Without men like Harrington, wars often stagnate. Yet the same qualities that made him effective also made him dangerous. Harrington blurred the line between achievement and entitlement. He assumed that success granted him leverage beyond the battlefield, that personal recognition was a natural extension of collective victory. When a casual remark was spoken, he interpreted it not through the lens of intent, but through the logic of competition. He won, therefore he was owed. That belief was consistent with his internal code, but it failed to account for the ecosystem of leadership around him. General Andrew Calloway represented the opposite force. Where Harrington pushed, Calloway balanced. Where Harrington demanded clarity, Calloway managed ambiguity. His decision to honor the implied bargain preserved unity in the short term, but it carried a hidden cost. By accommodating one man's sense of entitlement, he altered the morale and expectations of many others. Trust was not broken, but it was strained. And strained systems rarely snap immediately. They weaken quietly. This is where the story becomes timeless, because the conflict between Harrington and Calloway mirrors dilemmas far beyond wartime command. In workplaces, families, and institutions today, people still wrestle with the same tension: how to reward excellence without creating entitlement, how to maintain harmony without sacrificing fairness, and how to honor commitments without letting ego dictate outcomes. The lesson is not that ambition is wrong. Ambition drives progress. It sharpens focus and raises standards. But when ambition becomes detached from empathy, when personal victories overshadow shared effort, it begins to corrode the very structures that make success possible. Equally important is the lesson on leadership restraint. Calloway's choice teaches us that avoiding conflict can be as costly as confronting it. Peace maintained through concession must be monitored carefully, or it risks becoming precedent. True leadership requires not only knowing when to compromise, but when to draw lines that protect the integrity of the whole. For those watching today, the story offers a powerful reflection point. Ask yourself, when you succeed, do you see it as a platform to elevate others, or as justification to demand more? When someone makes an offhand promise, do you seek clarity, or do you quietly turn it into leverage? And when you lead, do you prioritize short-term peace over long-term trust? Applying this lesson in modern life means communicating clearly, honoring intent as much as outcome, and remembering that recognition gained at the expense of others rarely endures. The strongest teams, whether in business, community, or family, are built not on exceptional individuals alone, but on mutual respect and shared accountability. Before we close, and here's a question for you. Which do you believe creates stronger leadership in the long run? A, relentless ambition that drives results. B, balanced leadership that protects trust and fairness. Comment A or B below and let us know your choice. And beyond that, we'd love to hear your perspective. Have you experienced a situation where ambition crossed into entitlement, or where compromise cost more than expected? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your experience. If you found